Hello there. Welcome back to English 112. This is for class for Tuesday, the 29th of March, where I wanted to talk a little bit about the plot of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now that you've watched two different performances, the first half of the play being from Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and that's the reconstructed Globe Theatre, and then the second part being from Shakespeare in the Park, which is a very well-esteemed and well-known production that is done every summer. And obviously there are quite a few differences between the two because ultimately each performance is an adaptation, which is one of the reasons why I always talk about that it's important to read the play in its entirety as well as to watch performance or as many performances as possible so that you can get at least an idea of how ultimately it would appear on stage. As we know that we talked about Shakespeare's stage being very limited in some respects, nevertheless, it was still an area that allowed for lots of physical humor, as I think we saw in both versions of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Though, of course, performing A Midsummer Night's Dream in a park rather than on a stage does give it a sense of authenticity. And again, both productions have their own strengths and weaknesses. The plot of Midsummer Night's Dream is deliberately confusing because the theme is deliberately confusing. That basically what we are talking about is love, and that love itself is notoriously confusing. So, part one, in terms of the plot, we have Theseus and Hippolyta. They represent our first couple. Notice that all of the couples that we are introduced to in the play represent different life stages and represent different stations in life. And Theseus and Hippolyta are a king and a queen. Hippolyta is the queen of the Amazons, which is a very strong warrior race, and she has been conquered in war by King Theseus. So obviously she's not very happy about that. They very much represent a kind of typical love where their union is political rather than romantic. And during the time of the Renaissance, it was thought that romance would occur after marriage and affection would occur after marriage, not necessarily before. And Hermia and Lysander represent a young couple, and they are nobles rather than kings and queens. They are dating, so they aren't at the stage of a engagement, which is what Theseus and Hippolyta are, because again, Theseus has conquered Hippolyta in war, so he's won her hand in marriage. Hermia and Lysander are somewhat unusual in that their love is defined by romance, and Hermia dares to defy her father because his wishes are that she choose another suitor. And at the time, a daughter would have been viewed as a kind of property, and that ultimately the father could make a decision about how to dispose of his daughter as he so wanted. So the fact that she dares to defy her father would be considered rather scandalous for the time period. And we are also given another young couple, and they are also nobles who were in love prior to the play. Helena and Demetrius, who represented a kind of fickle love in the sense that Demetrius no longer is interested in Helena, which goes to show how quickly affections can change. However, Helena is still interested in Demetrius. That is a representation of unrequited love, when one lover is in love, but that love is not reciprocated. And then we have Fairy Oberon and Titania. They are a married couple, so they represent a much later stage in relationship. They are also an older couple. They too have their love conflicts because they are arguing over the possession of a child, a changeling child. So what we see are the power struggles that occur in love. And one would assume that the fairy kingdom would be superior in behavior and temperament to the humans, but that's not what we see in this play. Basically, what we see is that everyone is ridiculously absurd when it comes to love. And then ultimately we are given another subplot, and this is Bottom and his cohorts. They happen to be rehearsing a play, and we will see that performed in the fifth act of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it happens to be a play about love, since comedies are about love, and obviously A Midsummer Night's Dream is about love. Bottom is aptly named because he represents the bottom of the social scale, because he is a laborer. And he also is an idiot. He's quite full of himself, as we will see as the play unfolds. And of course, we had talked about Shakespeare's plays having a kind of 5-act structure. It looks like a pyramid. So the first act, which would be the left side of the pyramid, Act 1, that basically represents the introduction to the characters and the conflict. And of course, one of the major conflicts happens to be that Hermia has defied her father. So her father Aegeus, in frustration, has decided to appeal to the law of the land, and that's King Theseus, so that King Theseus can order Hermia to follow her father's will, or else she faces a nunnery or death, and both would be considered equally horrific punishments. He does give her, however, time to contemplate her options. That's going to be necessary as a plot device so that she has time to run away in the woods, so that we have development of the play over the next several acts. But it also, I think, is important thematically because King Theseus has his own love problems with Hippolyta. Remember, she's not entirely pleased that she's been conquered in war. But we do know that since we are watching a comedy, we are going to have a happy ending. So in the end, there will be resolution. So basically, Hermia and Lysander run away into the woods. In other words, the young couple that runs away from the defiant father figure. And the woods represent things that are untamed and uncivilized, where you don't have the law of man, which is what would be represented by Athens, which is where the play begins. Again, very common for Shakespeare to set his plays in exotic locations such as Athens, but it may as well be England, because after we're introduced to that, ultimately the rest seems very British. And if you think about young Goodman Brown going into the woods, again, something that's wild and untamed, where a lot of learning and realizations will go on, I think you can see parallels. Helena, illustrating how distorted thinking can get, how irrational someone can get when in love, convinces herself that if she were to tell Demetrius where Hermia is, that she's run away with Lysander in the woods, Demetrius will be so indebted to Helena that he'll love her again. Of course, that's irrational, and what ends up happening is that Demetrius goes into the woods to follow Hermia, which means that Helena is going to go into the woods to follow Demetrius. So this is a way that Shakespeare gets all of our major characters into the woods. And then, of course, we have Bottom and his cohorts, and we might have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, but their argument is that if they are going to be rehearsing a play, better to do so in the woods where they would have some privacy rather than in the city. So, as all of this unfolds, we basically have Fairy Oberon, who's quite upset with his defiant wife, and he instructs Fairy Oberon, one of his servants, his fairy servants, Puck, to distract his wife, Titania, Fairy Titania, so that she ultimately will not be paying attention when he takes that child. Again, this is a power play. There isn't any particular good reason why he wants that child. And the way that Fairy Titania is going to be distracted is that Puck is going to put some love juice into her eyes, so that when she awakes, the first thing she sees, she will fall in love with. Again, this is a thematic commentary that when we are in love, we tend to be very focused only on our love, and the things that used to matter to us, things like children, like changeling boys, no longer do. And Puck decides on his own, however, to have a little bit of fun, because Puck is mischievous, and he decides to turn Bottom into an ass. Now, Bottom's been acting like an ass, so why not turn him into a literal ass? And, of course, it just so happens that when Fairy Titania awakes, the first thing she sees is Bottom, who is a literal and figurative ass, and she falls completely and totally in love. To illustrate how blind we can be when we are in love, and so much so that we probably fall in love with asses and don't even see it ourselves, even though others do. And this blindness of love is something that we will see throughout this drama. Now, at this point, Puck is supposed to put the love juice on Demetrius's eyes so that he loves Helena. Because basically, and again, we might have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, Fairy Oberon has overheard everything and he feels a certain level of sympathy and empathy for Helena. Keep in mind that Helena is the tall blonde and Hermia is the short brunette. And the difference in appearance is important because based on the time, and perhaps even based today, all of the attention should go to the tall blonde, Helena. But instead, all of the men's attentions happen to be directed towards the short brunette. This will be important when we get to Act 3, when the insults begin to fly back and forth. In terms of the men, Demetrius and Lysander, they're very similar in appearance and also very similar in temperament, so that it's very easy to mix the two up. Again, a thematic statement from Shakespeare that one person is just as good as another when it comes to one's affections. Even though we think that the person we love is unique and irreplaceable, that's not the case. And even though Helena and Hermia have very different appearances, notice how similar their names are so that it's easy to mix them up again to again illustrate the idea that one is just as good as another. But it just so turns out that Puck is given instructions to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. And this is important in terms of how an actor and also a director want to play this particular scene. It could be that Puck just genuinely makes a mistake. Or it could be that Puck knows that he's supposed to choose Demetrius. He's the man wearing the Athenian garb, but decides to make a, quote, error and put the love juice on Lysander's eyes instead. But this is going to result in all kinds of conflicts and mix-ups in terms of love, which is what we expect in a comedy. Because ultimately, Lysander will awake, and the first thing he sees is Helena. So now Lysander no longer loves Hermia, he loves Helena. And then at that point, Puck and Oberon need to rectify the error, putting the love juice onto Demetrius's eyes, but the love juice is never taken out of Lysander's eyes. So now we basically have the exact opposite of how the play began. The play began with two lovers, two men, Demetrius and Lysander, both in love with Hermia. And now we've got two men, Lysander and Demetrius, both in love with Helena. Obviously, this is going to lead to conflict and confusion. Helena and Hermia, to make matters worse, used to be best friends. Notice how I said used to. Because now, as they are fighting over love relationships, we'll see how they become best enemies by the time we get to Act 3. Again, illustrating how fragile friendships are when they are faced with conflict associated with love. So now both men love Helena, the tall blonde. Neither loves Hermia, the short brunette. Helena is convinced this must be some sort of a terrible joke. And Hermia is convinced that Helena has somehow used her height and her hair color to steal her men. So as we continue on in Act 3, which would be the height of that pyramid, that would be the tip of the pyramid, we've got a good number of insults flying back and forth. It's what I call the catfight scene. Many of the insults might not necessarily seem to make sense. For instance, painted maypole. And this was an insult because painted was a reference to cosmetics and the idea that women who wore cosmetics were fake or false and were trying to seduce, not through natural means. Maypole is a reference to height, that Helena is very tall. But also, if you think about the title, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Midsummer is supposed to represent the summer equinox. And there are also references to May Day in there. These are two pagan holidays that are highly associated with fertility, which is something that we will talk about next class. Rather ironic, because while they're associated with fertility, it's of utmost importance that at the very least the women remain virginal until the ending of the play, because a woman who is not virginal prior to marriage would be considered damaged goods at the time. So at one point there's reference to the idea that Demetrius has made love to Helena. By making love, what they're talking about is wooing. They're not talking about consummating relationship. And we'll see that as the lovers are in the woods when Helena continues to pursue Demetrius. And Demetrius at one point says, if you continue to pursue me, I'll do the mischief in the wood. And the idea being that ultimately he's going to threaten her with the loss of her virginity. But at any rate, going back to the idea of maypole, maypoles were very important on May Day, which was again a pagan holiday that celebrated fertility. And if you've ever heard around dancing around the maypole, which some elementary schools still do, the maypole was supposed to be a representation of the phallus. So it was a phallic symbol. So in other words, this is a very sexually charged day that has a very sexually charged reference, and the insult is quite sexually charged. That not only is Helena painted, in other words, she's a prostitute or has the airs of prostitute because she's wearing cosmetics, but she also is a phallus at the same time. Just to give you an idea, but we'll talk about some of the other insults. Many of the insults about Hermia's lack of height. She's called an acorn, a bead, a minimus, even a puppet, that which is controlled by somebody else. But again, a puppet is very small. So ultimately, we know that we have to have a happy ending. If we were watching a tragedy, these lovers would come to blows and probably kill one another. But instead, we need to have intervention so we do have that happy ending, because we know that comedies are supposed to end with marriage, or at the very least, the promise of marriage, with no death. So basically, the love juice is removed from Lysander, and he returns to loving Hermia. But the love juice remains on Demetrius, so he remains loving Helena. And the love juice, of course, is taken away from Titania, so she's no longer in love with the donkey and ass, because at this point, Oberon has taken the changeling child from her as she was distracted. And King Theseus decides that since most of the couples are happy, or actually all of the couples are happy, he's not going to intervene. The only person who's unhappy is Hermia's father, Aegeus, who's just going to have to accept this, which is actually a rather radical and bold statement that Hermia, as daughter, gets her will. She defies her father. So this is a very interesting commentary about gender. However, that's somewhat undercut when we have Queen Titania, who basically is humiliated and loses a changeling boy. So don't expect clear-cut answers in Shakespeare. At this particular point, the love juice is also, or the donkey spell, I should say, is removed from Bottom so that he can be returned to human form. But of course, he's still going to act like an ass, because that's part of his personality. And then basically, it would seem in Act 4 that the play is done. Keep in mind, those Shakespearean plays are 5 acts, not 4 acts. The 5th act in A Midsummer Night's Dream seems almost superfluous, but trust me, nothing is superfluous in Shakespeare. This is where we get the play within a play, which is a common Shakespearean technique to show a play within a play. Very meta, so he's commenting on the idea that we're watching a play and that he's a playwright. The play Pyramus and Thisbe, which might remind you of another famous Shakespeare play, and that happens to be Romeo and Juliet, which is what A Midsummer Night's Dream could have been if we had had a negative ending. And what we see in Pyramus and Thisbe is poor writing and poor play acting. And this is usually viewed as a commentary on Shakespeare's competition, that Shakespeare is showing rather than telling us that this is the level of quality or lack of quality that we will experience if we happen to spend our hard-earned dollars not on Shakespeare's plays, but going to see some of his competition. Poor acting and poor writing. It almost reminds me of an elementary school production where everything is so literal. We see lots of physical humor as well, so this is a great opportunity to play up the comedic aspects in the play. There's also a good amount of bawdiness, which I'll talk about next class, because there is a sexual element to A Midsummer Night's Dream, and often sexual elements in Shakespeare's plays as a whole. And notice that the couples, the human couples at least, are watching Pyramus and Thisbe and laughing and, of course, enjoying the absurdity of it all, but they never stop to consider that they were equally absurd just a few moments earlier when they were ready to come to blows. The idea is that they lack insight about their own absurdity when it comes to love. And this is a statement ultimately for us as audience watching this play, that if we are enjoying the play and mocking all of the characters and enjoying their absurdity, but we never stop to watch and reflect upon our own faults and frailties, well then we are equally clueless and lack insight, just like the characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream. We end with Puck's final speech. perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, and that you have but slumbered here." And basically, it's a wonderful opportunity not only for Puck to offer apologies in case he's offended somebody. And since this play critiques so many different kinds of relationships and social stations, there is a great possibility of someone or many someones being offended. This is also an opportunity for the actor who is playing Puck to ask for amends or forgiveness. And this is a wonderful opportunity as well for Shakespeare, through the actor playing Puck, through the character of Puck, asking for forgiveness. Because the Renaissance was a time where one could be pretty open in terms of sexuality and in terms of violence, but not in terms of politics. One had to be very careful about political commentary. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the major elements in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Notice that it's set at night. The idea that, again, all kinds of darkness is associated with night. It's also the time in which we dream. Night is oftentimes associated with sexuality as well. And the idea of dreams, that love itself is a kind of dream, that it's something that's uncontrollable, something that perhaps is not real. Even think about some of the language we use in terms of love, that we tend to fall in love. Usually fall has some negative connotations associated with it. Something that, again, is beyond our control, something that's accidental, something that is hurtful, something that could even kill. But despite all of these negative commentaries about love, we still have our happy ending with a good amount of music and dance. It's one of the reasons why I wanted you to see a production, just so that you could see the emphasis on music and dance. So next class is Advising Day on Thursday. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that we are not meeting. Instead, it is a day where students should be meeting with their advisors rather than going to class to set up their next schedule. And we have the schedule available both for the summer sessions, Summer Session 1, which begins in about mid-June. No, I'm sorry, which begins in about mid-May and ends in about early to mid-July, and then Summer Session 2, which begins in about mid-July and ends in late August. And basically, it's each summer session is the equivalent of your typical 16-week semester, but highly condensed. So you do in approximately 8 weeks or so, which you would normally do in a 16-week session. But the advantage is that in a fairly short amount of time, you would have completed a class. And obviously, we offer fewer classes during each of the summer sessions than we would during a traditional academic semester. And as you know, we offer lots of options in terms of both in-person classes and online classes and hybrid classes and late start classes. So all of those are in the course schedule, which is now live on the GCC website. And you'll see in the notes below that I've included a link for that. In terms of your journey with English classes, I suspect that your next step would be to take a 200 level English class. Now that you've taken an introduction to literature, a 200 level English class is a specialized English class on a particular area of literature. So it could be a particular time period or it could be a particular author. So for instance, Summer Session 1, I'm teaching a class in Women in Literature, where actually we're beginning with a piece that you are familiar with, Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, basically female writers from the 1800s. In the fall semester, I teach a class in Gothic literature where we study some of the classics of Gothic, things like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So we offer a wide variety of classes. Oh, and I should note that if you happen to be a horror fan, you might not only just be interested in Gothic literature, but you might also be interested in a communications class that I teach that focuses on horror film in media and Popular Culture, CMN 201. But if you have any questions about those classes, please feel free to ask me. Or if you just have questions about classes in general, I may or may not be able to answer those questions. If it's public speaking, I do teach public speaking classes, so I'm probably better equipped to answer a question about that than I would be about mathematics. But again, feel free to ask if you have any questions about the schedule or about your next steps with registration. So when we return, that will be on Tuesday, the 4th of April, and we will continue to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. I wanted to talk about some of the important quotes in the play, and have us prepare for A Raisin in the Sun, which happens to be the last drama that we're going to be reading in our drama section. I think you will find it to be an easier read because it's much more contemporary. It was written in the 1950s in the United States, so it's our culture and it's our time period, at least fairly close to our time period. And you should start reading that play. What would be ideal, I hope, though I know ideal isn't always possible, is that you would have finished reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, and now you are beginning to read A Raisin in the Sun. And again, we'll watch a performance, and then we will talk about the play, and I will give you some suggested paper topics for dramas, because eventually, by the ending of the semester, you will be writing a paper on drama, very similar to the kind of paper you wrote for a short story in terms of length and focus. Just this time you would be focusing on one of the dramas, Oedipus or Midsummer or Raisin. And just like in our last unit, you will be asked to submit in a journal about A Raisin or about the drama section. So you will be asked to write approximately a page or so on A Raisin in the Sun, approximately a page or so on A Midsummer Night's Dream, and approximately a page or so on Oedipus the King. And that will be before you have your paper due, so that hopefully those journals can assist you with writing a paper. So for today's attendance question, and that'll be due on Thursday the 31st at 10 a.m., what did you find to be the most surprising thing about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising thing about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.